After my grandparents passed away, my parents were given one of their possessions, a little black book. It's about the size of a pack of note cards. The cover has the texture of leather, even though it's just stiff cardboard. The edges of the pages are gold. Same with the trim around the cursive lettering on the front of the book. There's one word and a date. Diary, 1919. The book belonged to my great-uncle and aunt, Aldine and Eva Brunk, who were missionaries in India for over 30 years. My parents keep the book in their gun safe. The irony is not lost on them.
For being pacifist, that gun safe does not reflect very well. This is under bullets. A box of bullets.
Keep it from warping.
July 10, 19...
The diary was written by Eva, who worked as a nurse. My mom never met her and barely remembers Aldine, but information on them isn't difficult to find. The Mennonite Church USA archives has 4 boxes of material from them. I can even view photos of the couple, digitized on the archive's Flickr account. All this material provides a window into Aldine and Eva's mission work. But like any window, the view is limited by the person who constructs it. Paging through the diary, there's other missionaries referenced, patients that Eva cared for as well. But the only perspective that my mom and I ever get is Eva's. And even then, we're only privy to the window she gives us. The items that she thought were important enough to write down in her loose, cursive handwriting. Some days, there's only a single sentence, like on Thursday, January 2.
Did accounts and annual reports.
Other days, we're given a fuller perspective, with writing that spills over into the next day's page, like on Thursday, May 22.
We went out to dinner. STAID, stayed all night because the motor was not working well. Just before we left home, a number of famine cases came.
Among them.
And yet, there are other days, sometimes weeks, where the pages, along with our tiny window into Eva's life, are just blank.
So...
It stops. Oh, no, it picks up.
It might be possible to figure out what the couple did on those days, where they went, who they interacted with. Someone might have written it down. That writing might have gotten saved. It's entirely possible that story may still exist out there. But whatever happened during those days and weeks, Eva's perspective won't be a part of it. Her story will need to be told by someone else. On this episode of MissionWary, Linda and I will talk with Anicka Fast about how the stories of mission become the history of mission. We'll examine why some stories get preserved while others become forgotten. We'll also look at what happens when a rediscovered perspective challenges those preserved stories. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Linda.
Hey, Travis.
This is episode number 6. This is the last episode in the first season of MissionWary.
Oh, man, maybe we shouldn't be so happy. Maybe we should be kind of sad. This has been so much fun.
It has. I guess I was just mostly happy that we made it to the end and that
That's
we're still
true.
friends. But
Yeah, that's right.
well, I won't take too much time because I'm excited to get into this interview with Anicka Fast, but I'm also aware that the reason why we're having this interview is because you let me know about this story and what Anicka's been doing. Would you give a little bit of explanation of your connection with that?
Yeah, well, I know about Anicka because of my husband, Rod, who was executive coordinator of Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission until February of this year. And he knew Anicka from working with her and was very excited about her dissertation and would tell me some of the things that he was learning from her as she went through Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission's archives and got to hear some exciting stories and So that's how I know about Anicka and this story.
Well, I'm excited to jump into this interview if you're ready to go.
Yep. Let's go, Travis.
I'm Anicka Fast, and for the last 5 years, I've been working on a dissertation on a PhD in history and theology at Boston University. So I've just finished that in April. I am just beginning a term with MCC as representatives for MCC in Burkina Faso with my husband, John. And we have 2 daughters, Anne-Sophie and Micah, and we're now just on the verge of moving to live in Africa for the next at least 5 years. I also grew up as the daughter of missionary parents who worked in Papua New Guinea for most of my childhood.
So, what started your interest in this research?
Yes, people ask me, why are you writing something about a history of Mennonite mission engagement in Congo when you didn't grow up there? Where did the interest come from? I would say there's a few different things. One is, as I was growing up in Papua New Guinea, my parents were exposing me to experiences of the church in different kinds of contexts. And they, through their example, they always made it clear that each of those places we were in, whether we were sitting in a pew and singing with an organ, or whether we were sitting on a cement floor and singing a cappella in the South Pacific, that was all church. And so I started, I think, probably having a very vague understanding that mission meant developing connections with church around the world. And of course, defining mission that way makes it broad. It doesn't just limit it to the people that travel from one country to another. And then as I went on in life, eventually working in Congo for 3 years with Mennonite Central Committee, one of the things that made an impression on me then, I think also directly contributed to my research interests, was we were working with hospitals that were owned by Mennonite and Mennonite Brethren churches there. And those institutions were struggling. Decades previously, they had been constructed with funding primarily from mission, and now they were dilapidated and the people were having difficulty with paying the staff, and it was hard for local people to afford the care there. It was a hard situation at the hospitals. And so we were always interacting with the memory of what the time of mission had been like. Because by the time we were there were not North American missionaries from mission agencies. There was MCC, but there were not personnel from mission agencies who were living and working with the Mennonite churches and living in Congo. But people had a strong memory of that time. And for us, when we looked at it, we thought, this is a heavy memory. Look at this heavy legacy that these missionaries left behind. Look at these institutions that are crumbling and these mission stations that aren't being maintained, and how could they have ever thought that it was a good idea to build these kinds of structures and buildings? That was kind of our feeling as we walked in there, but that wasn't the kind of memory that people were telling us about when they were telling us. They were saying, we wish that those people were still here. They were also talking about feeling abandoned, feeling like a relationship had ended and they wished it hadn't ended. And also talking about the importance of those buildings as being physical places that gave them some kind of dignity as being visible members of the Mennonite church in the world. And now it was like they were dusty and they were broken down, and it was like they had been forgotten. And so I'm really oversimplifying it, but there was a sense of, I'm trying to remember something that happened, and these people also here living near this hospital are also remembering, and we're not remembering things the same way. And it started making me think a lot about memory and about the memory of mission. Specifically, if you think about mission as a process of a relationship, an ecclesial relationship, a church relationship, then how did that relationship start? And then it matters how we remember how it started. And looking at how those memories diverge becomes something important. And how can and should we remember it?
So, in your research, which stories did you find yourself focusing on, or which were easy to tell and which were more difficult?
Yeah, deciding what stories to tell, what stories to try to tell, And the actual process of telling them was really a place of struggle. And the reason it was a struggle is because I think telling a story is a powerful thing to do. And so when you start interacting with other stories people have told, you're interacting with the fact that some people had more power to tell stories than other people did. And then you realize that as you tell a story, you have power as well to tell certain stories and not others. So one of the fun things about being a historian, it's like being an investigative journalist, except the people that you're investigating are mostly gone. They can't do anything to you anymore. But you're still finding out all kinds of things that are hidden behind the official story. And then you're figuring out how to talk about those things publicly and how much you should be talking about them. So I remember, for example, reading through the official minutes of Congo Inland Mission. And I wrote down for every single meeting, where was this meeting and what were the main things they talked about, and I was reading every single word in those minute books. And eventually you started to see that there was this woman, her name was Alma During, who was clearly having a major impact on the course of events of these board meetings. But it was kind of subtle until you started looking and realizing. At some point I actually counted it up and realized like 40% of these meetings make a reference to this woman. And that's certainly more than they refer to any other single individual. And I was reading about her in other sources, other official histories that had been commissioned by the mission board. So they were like the epitome of official. And she would be in there, and sometimes she would just be mentioned as, oh yes, During was there, she did this and this and this. But there was a lot of things that clearly weren't being said about her. There was a lot of silence about her in some of those official histories. And then eventually, when I was able to find a bundle of her own handwritten correspondence, then all the things kind of start falling into place. You start to see her perspective, you can totally understand why the men on the board, why they're mentioning her in the first place, and secondly, why they're not talking about her in the official histories, because there was significant struggle and conflict going on between her and many of the members of the board. So that's one example of a story where that didn't make it into the official story, but it was really important to tell it. Because when you go back and look at it, I mean, if it hadn't been for her, there would not ever have been Congo Inland Mission. And so she ended up becoming kind of this character that was woven through many of the chapters of my dissertation. A similar thing came along when it came to trying to reconstruct what Congolese people during this time were thinking and what their motivations were for going and living on these mission stations that North American Mennonites were building around the very first decades of the 20th century in Kasai region in Congo. And there, it was also hugely complicated to try to reconstruct what they were thinking, how they were experiencing the arrival of these North Americans and also Europeans, because their voice was almost absent from the sources that I had access to. And then even when they would be mentioned in those sources, it wasn't their own voice that was talking. It was someone else who was talking about them and interpreting what they thought. But then in the end, I had to rely also on the memories of Congolese people today who can't remember 100 years back. They do not have an oral tradition that goes 100 years back for those particular stories. So it's not even that they heard stories about this from grandparents, but they were remembering things that happened 50 years ago. And I had to decide that I was going to use some of their memories as a way of helping me to interpret the things that happened another 50 years earlier, which is a risky thing to do.
So, Anicka, I'm sorry. This is starting to get a little bit above my comprehension pay grade, if I'm completely honest.
Okay.
Would you be able to explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, well, let me give one example. So there was a North American Mennonite Brethren missionary whose name was Hollinger-Janzen, and he was married to Ernestina. So Aaron and Ernestina were some of the first missionaries with Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission, except it was called Congo Inland Mission back then. They worked for Congo Inland Mission for about, I think, 10 years, and then they resigned and started an independent mission, which later became affiliated with Mennonite Brethren. So Aaron and Ernestina in the 1920s were setting up a mission station at Kafumba in which they were doing a huge amount of economic self-supporting activities because they did not have support from the Mennonite Brethren Church and they had resigned from the Congo Inland Mission. And so they were doing lots of work with Congolese people on self-sustaining a livelihood there at Kafumba. And the way that they're remembered, even though this happened in the 1920s, which is prior to living memory for everyone that I had access to, they're remembered by Congolese historians that I talked to as kind of these heroes. I think the best I can express it is the memories that people were telling me. They had this memory of Aaron and Ernestina as people who were living together with Congolese people on a mission station and surviving together from the produce of the land. So there was a sense of having a shared source of sustenance. And that was something that Congolese people were proud of, especially Mennonite Brethren, to say this is our origins. And it was a shame, they say, that the Mennonite Brethren Conference came and took over and stopped those self-sustaining activities and replaced them with funding to support church work instead of letting us keep on going with selling palm oil to be able to fund what we were doing. So there's an example where nobody really can remember what happened in the 1920s anymore. But that memory has somehow remained alive in a way that is very powerful for a number of Congolese historians, mostly Mennonite Brethren, who tell that to me, and they use that as an important lesson to be learned. But I didn't hear that story from North Americans. North Americans either didn't talk about that at all, or else they saw it as an unfortunate, embarrassing deviation from what mission should be. Because for them, Hollinger-Janzen was like this colonial plantation missionary who was running palm oil industry with African labor. That's terrible, right? That's embarrassing. We want to get away from that. And obviously it was far better when the church in North America was paying for the things that were going on rather than having people having to do labor. And so it's very difficult to reconstruct what actually happened there in the 1920s at Kafumba. And so that was probably one of the hardest and most interesting chapters for me, was trying to go back and look and say, well, what was the significance of what was going on? And how do I let those competing memories guide the research that I do in the primary sources? Because there are documents that the Jansens wrote that I can read, and there are colonial sources that show what the palm oil industry was like in that region at that exact time. But, to what extent do I let people's memories from today that might not be accurate still guide the way that I interpret those sources? That was probably one of the hardest things. And yet, I think it's important to recognize that all of us, when we interact with the past, are being influenced by memories in some ways. There isn't any neutral way to look at the past.
We'll be right back. In speaking with people, with Congolese historians, did you get a sense of the impression of how that missional relationship, how that church relationship was viewed from the Congolese perspective?
So, of course, the Congolese perspective has many different perspectives, and I probably heard disproportionately perspective of Congolese men. But I asked this question to one person who I interviewed, whose name is Kikweta. And Kikwete very tragically died last summer after having spent about 15 years of his life really deeply working on reconstructing the history of Mennonite Brethren Church in Congo. One of the questions I asked him was on Mennonite mission stations, and here we're talking about the 50s, 1950s, the time when he was a child and he was remembering. I asked, what kind of understanding of the church did you get from living on the station? He said, well, there were really two kinds of understandings that we got simultaneously. Because the way that the mission station was organized, it was in many ways segregated. White missionaries lived in one section, and us Congolese who were pastors or who were working employees or working on the station, we lived in another section. But there was something important for him, and that was that in between those two places, there was the church. And he said that's where we met. We met there, and we went there together, and when we sat there in that church, then we believed that we were part of one body together. But at the same time, even in the church, of course, there were some seats that kind of unofficially only the white missionaries would sit in because their benches had backs on them. So even in the church, he said, this distinction would follow us there. But even then, there was this kind of way of seeing that at the very same moment as socially and physically the station was divided in a way that separated us, and yet there was also some kind of way in which we also were united. And that painful distinction or dichotomy or division between the ideal and the reality, and yet the reality also has that there is a place where they're connected in reality on the benches of the church. That's probably something that I think he's wrestled with for much of his life. And I think that's one of the central questions I tried to trace in this dissertation is, well, how did those ideas collide with each other, and where were those places where there was that meeting, even if it was just for a moment?
In looking at those stories and the way you have to interpret a bit of what actually happened, what conclusions or what ideas did you draw from that the church today should take with them?
What I was trying to do in the dissertation was I was trying to make an argument about the way we need to remember mission, and that we need to remember it in a way that makes us more into one people.
Us as the global church.
The global church, yeah. If the way we're remembering what happened isn't looking at it through that lens, then maybe we're not remembering right. And so I think that one of the important insights that comes out is that when we remember this story, we need to be careful about the way we set up connection between mission and colonialism. So Mennonite missionaries from North America were coming and working in Congo during the epitome of Belgian colonialism in Congo. In the 1930s, this was really the time when Belgium was extracting the maximum that they could from the labor and the land and the resources of Congo. And Mennonite missionaries were right there at that very moment. And, how did they interact with that? It's a hugely complicated question. But I think it's important, instead of asking, did they simply collaborate with that colonial imagination, or did they not? That shouldn't be the question that we should be asking. Not because it's not important, but because an even more helpful question we could ask is, to what extent were the believers in that encounter, both Congolese believers and North American believers, to what extent were they embracing an imagination that made them into members of one body? Members of one body politically, members of one body as an alternative way of having a shared livelihood economically, for example. To what extent did they understand themselves to be an alternative to the politics of violence and domination that was going on around them? And if you ask the question like that, then you give a lot more agency to the role that Congolese people had in that story. Because they had an understanding of what they were doing when they were interacting with North Americans and Europeans who were coming. And they did not lack agency completely in that encounter. And they were interacting with and associating themselves with mission stations for a reason that was related to their understanding of the church. And so if you ask the question like that, then colonialism is still an extremely important question. But you can't limit yourself to the question of, is mission colonialist or not? Because then you miss way too much. Don't look back at mission just at the powerful people, because then you miss tons of what was going on the ground. That may have been the main story. And you miss that when you assume mission was colonialist and you only look at it through the lens of the official narratives.
Linda, thank you so much for joining me on that interview.
Yeah, very rich.
And I got to admit, when we first were putting together this interview, I was a little nervous about having this interview be the last episode of this season of MissionWary, because it felt a little weird to be looking back at a example of mission that's almost 100 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really glad we did, because I think that idea of helping to give agency to everyone who was connected with mission really is a great capstone to a lot of these conversations we've had over these past 6 episodes.
Yeah, and I think, Travis, we're actually following African wisdom.
Oh, really?
Yes. In Ghana, there is the Sankofa bird, and they have these symbols that symbolize proverbs. And the Sankofa bird has kind of a gooseneck looking back over its shoulder. And the proverb is that you can't journey forward without knowing where you've come from. So you look back to see where you're going. So I think maybe, through all these interviews, we've kind of absorbed some of this wisdom that comes to us from our African brothers and sisters, because without knowing it, like you said, what might seem weird to end with looking backward is maybe exactly what we need to do to walk forward.
Well, Anicka even said it's nice because enough time has passed that you can start forming a larger story and not necessarily having to worry about people that may still be living being upset with how that might be told.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also a really big responsibility, too, of knowing that the people who you're telling a story about, or people that are involved in the story, don't have a voice anymore.
Yeah, they're not going to argue with your interpretation of what you think they said.
Right. For better and for worse, because there's a lot of responsibility that comes with that then.
Yeah, I love what she says about agency, and I love the story of Alma During.
Mm-hmm.
Just that how, with digging, Anicka found this woman who was never mentioned in official reports, and you can just imagine she was a thorn in the side of mission administrators. But yeah, her quote that there wouldn't have been, the
Congo Inland Mission
without Alma During.
Right.
And how much courage that must give to each of us who feels like the work we're doing isn't noticed and insignificant. But shoot, 100 years from now, somebody might say it was really important what this person that we never heard of did.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that struck me about Anicka's dissertation and how it felt so applicable as kind of a capper to this podcast series was the way Anicka talked about how measuring mission not on whether it was colonialist or not, just kind of a yes or no question, not basing it on that, but more looking at, what was the actual quote? How the missionaries and the people they lived with became one body in like the global church.
Yes.
And the quote that I had written down was, to what extent did they understand themselves to be an alternative to the politics of violence and domination that was going on around them?
Yeah, and in my notes, I've distilled it even further.
All right.
To what extent were they embracing the vision of one global body of Christ? That's what I have as my big takeaway. And again, it goes back to relationships that I had talked about before. To what extent are we embracing that one global body of Christ?
Mm-hmm. And that takes it out of just a specific situation or a specific time period. And it makes us able to ask that question of mission work today
Mm-hmm.
and what mission will look like in the future.
Amen.
But we have one extra part to this episode. So Anicka mentioned Congo Inland Mission and its successor agency, Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission. We happen to have a connection, or mostly just you happen to have a connection, with someone in that organization. Do you want to give a little bit of explanation to that?
Yeah, well, I think I alluded to him before when we talked about how I became aware of Anicka's research. But yes, Rod Hollinger-Janzen is my husband, and he worked as the executive coordinator of Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission until February of 2021. So he agreed to join us for a few minutes on this podcast.
All right. Rod Hollinger-Janzen, I'm so glad to have you on the show. Linda and I went 5 episodes without having a special guest for part of our outro here, but this is the 6th episode, and we're breaking that streak. We're happy to have you on the show to talk a little bit about your connection with Anicka and her dissertation.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for me to be here. So the reason that Anicka and I got connected around her dissertation was that at the time I was the executive coordinator for Africa Inter-Mennonite Mission, and Anicka wanted to use our archives to do research about the origins of the Congolese Mennonite churches. And we were happy to allow her to do that. And of course, when she was ready to present her thesis, I was able to join by Zoom and listen in on the conversation. And I was really intrigued by a lot of the things that were said. And so I asked Anicka if I could read the thesis. And she was very generous, and she sent me the full copy, and I read through it. That got me thinking about also how important it would be for the Congolese churches to have access to the thesis. Now, it's written in English, but I wrote Anicka then some months later and said, would you be willing to allow me to work on this, helping to translate the thesis into French? And she was open to that suggestion. And so I jumped in. And as I worked my way through the material, it became more and more obvious why this was an important thing to do. First of all, no one has dug into this in the way that Anicka has. And so these origin stories of 2 of the major Congolese Mennonite denominations, I think the story has maybe been told in various ways, but not with access to the kinds of sources that Anicka had. That means that this is a fuller story, a bigger story than what has been told before. And it's also a more public story because it's now available in print, both in English and soon in French. It's also fresh ground for Congolese of this generation who don't have the kinds of written sources that we have in our archives here. And so it's more difficult, often in their case, to trace things back to the beginning. And so it seemed very important that they have access to this information, not only because this is their story, but also for future generations of Congolese historians who I think will be delighted at the use that Anicka has made of the archives that have really brought to life a story that's been completely hidden from public view up to this point. And the thing that I'm probably most excited about is that I think that her approach and the way she illustrates these problems through actual examples, I think could open the way for a much more honest conversation between North American Mennonites and Congolese Mennonites about our relationship today, because some of these same power imbalances still exist. And, we need to address them rather than pretending that they're not there. And I think that this thesis lays the groundwork for that.
Well, Rod, thank you very much for taking time to talk with me a little bit. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
All right, Linda, I just wanted to say, as this is the last episode of this season, thank you so much for being with me and walking through this exploration of mission. I have felt very privileged to walk through it with you because you are easily an expert on the subject.
It's my life. I don't know that I'm an expert. Anyway, it's been so much fun walking on this journey with you, Travis. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Pleasure is all mine.
We won't say goodbye. In a lot of countries, you don't say goodbye. You just say till the next time we see each other. So
I like that.
The next time we hear each other's voices, right?
Sounds good, Linda.
All right.
So, that's our episode. Thanks for joining us. For more information about what Mennonite Mission Network is doing through partnerships across the U.S. and around the world, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or go to our website, MennoniteMission.net. This episode concludes the first season of MissionWary. And as co-host and editor of this series, I had the privilege of spending a lot of time with the wisdom and the stories our guests shared with this podcast. I'd like to take a moment to thank all our guests from the past 6 episodes: Linda Hollinger-Janzen, Joe Swatsky, Katarina Friesen, Mike Sherrill, Marisa Smucker, Andrea Sawyer-Kirksey, James Crable, and Anicka Fast. These episodes would, quite literally, be nothing without you all. Thank you. MissionWary was written and edited by me, Travis Dirksen, with additional writing by Linda Hollinger-Janzen. Music provided under license by Epidemic Sound. This has been MissionWary. See you next time.